So thank you so much for being here today. Doch in Bauch, Théo Dwyer. I'm gonna try to, very much like as a epitome of Welsh landscapes. Cows are munching the time away. I'm gonna try to showcase, what, given the new policy plans that have been unveiled in July, how and the broader range of goals they're trying to achieve compared to the former cap. I'm going to try to showcase to you what would be the challenges and opportunities linked to the sustainable farming scheme. And this relating to my research method, the Agrarian Diagnosis. So I'll just talk very rapidly about the research method to then go straight into the challenges that I think are facing Welsh farming, some of the things linked to the accessibility, reach and uptake of the SFS, and as well as trying to model the impact of SFS on farms and what would be the potential economic results. And finally, I'll try to showcase some of my fears arising from my systemic sector-wide vision, after my work in Wales. So most of what you'll see today is the result of a work that I started to do for a paper, a presentation at a conference that I hope to do in December. Yes, you have to write it by, it had to be written by, September, which is quite early for a conference, but it helped a lot to make this presentation. So about the research method, the Agrarian Diagnosis. Agrarian means you're talking about farming, you're talking about an agrarian system, which means you're looking at the technical side of things around farming, but also the social and economic side within a landscape, if that makes sense. So you have kind of an integrative approach. It makes the research method kind of a holistic way of understanding the functioning of small agricultural area. And you have as well a fine-grained qualitative construction of a farming model. My approach is mostly farm-based. The farm is my base unit, and I really try to integrate whenever I'm working the different scales, but as well as different sciences, and be it policy or farming science or the market and economics. So whenever I'm covering an area, it's a lot of field work and it takes a long time, and you can see that there are different successive phases to it, which are quite interesting and give you a very good understanding of farming system between field work, desk, a lot of interviews with farmers. Over my now 3 years in Wales, I've talked with approximately 260 farmers in 4 study areas that I deem as representative study areas to understand the Welsh farming context. So 4 of them. So the first one that I covered was South Pembrokeshire, that was typical of West Wales Hills. And what's interesting is that you had a very mixed farming system, very focused on high added value productions, be it beef, in terms of beef, dairy, or even potato farming, with as well some low intensity producers. But and on the flip side, I studied another lowland area, an area that we would qualify as a lowland, the Vale of Clwyd. That could not be only considered as a lowland because it's an alluvial valley which rises on the side towards rough grazing and kind of semi-mountainous area, with a broader range of agroecological conditions, drier conditions than Pembrokeshire and colder as well. Obviously, the mix of production is not the same. We have more dairy and beef and sheep, but less potato farming, but sometimes as well more cereal cropping, which could be seen as surprising, but linked to the climate is quite sensible. In terms of upland or uplandish area, I've covered 2, Bala and the Powys around Rhayader. What would be interesting to you is that the area around Snowdonia, around Bala, has a higher difference between the best parts of the ecosystem and the lower part and the worst parts of the ecosystem in terms of production potential. Rhayader is more challenging as a whole. if you make the average, and it tends to be a bit colder overall in average when you take into consideration the world production potential, which would not come straight away. Which explains the fact that in Bala, along the traditional beef and sheep system, including some mountain-focused one, you would have like some dairy spring calving farms in the valley. Something that you do not find in Hayader, in which you will find more like high added value kind of integrated productions of poultry or pigs, etc. That do not require, that are not linked with the land potential, but more linked with the number of people working there. So I hope it showcased to you the bit kind of the different areas I've covered. I'm not going to talk more about the challenges I think Welsh farming is facing. With my method, to understand those challenges, I usually work with a farming system vision, taking into account the different components of farming system, being cropping, livestock, or the work part of the system, to get to an output. And I tend to always have family farm vision, which aligns with the SFS goals. So to start with, okay, this is not a very nice slide. I know there's a lot of things on this, but you'll see, you can have a look later and you'll see it makes sense. What I want to showcase with this slide is that not everyone is equal. Welcome to the Vale of Clwyd. You have 3 different areas on this in the Vale of Clwyd here. So the Mudstone Hills, Limestone Hills, and the Clwyd Range and the core of the Vale. And all of them offer different conditions to farm and different potential, what you can do, even in terms of, be it in terms of cropping, what you can do on it, the production potential, but as well how you can improve them, or what you will be allowed to enable to, what you can do with the given policies at the time. And I think something that is quite important is that in this kind of agroecological conditions, where you have a range of potential available to farmers, and combined to tendencies, or how people are from a social point of view or economic point of view, you restrain a lot the range of possibilities or opportunities for farm, be it in terms of diversification or differentiation. So my key message here is like not everyone is equal, and in the study of farm evolution, it certainly shows people that were in better parts of the ecosystem tend access to some evolutions or a better social or economic position, tend to have a better growth curve for the farm. Right. I also want to showcase you something that I've worked quite a lot at the middle of this year. The fact that in most of Welsh farming we have a coevolution between the environment of farms, the environment and farming during centuries. So this landscape, so here we are on Penllyn, so not exactly one of my study areas, but I think it's as good an example as any. The fact that we have a coevolution, the landscape is a result of the use of the land by farmers during centuries, and a gradual evolution, be it in terms of culturally, be it in terms of biological capital, having the adequate breed to graze these very rough, like clag, kind of very rocky mountains, the practices, etc., etc. Everything has evolved gradually, but it's also linked with external factors. It's also linked with areas outside of this coevoluting like landscapes, and you have different scale at which we have impacts from these external factors. So in this very attractive landscape, you have the opportunities and the challenge linked with tourism. For example, now you have climate change that kind of disrupts the functioning of farming system, and as well you have an aging sector and quite high economic pressure and some pressure on livestock farming, kind of impacting through coevolution. That means that you had a weakening link between the environment and farming, and of this coevolution, particularly in some integrated lowlands, integrating within the wider market and the wider society, I would say. Okay, so just to showcase the economic challenge, I wanted to show you this. It's an example. It's not deemed to be representative or like to be exhaustive, but it showcases to you different kind of archetypes, model farms, and their kind of economic performance, and to try to show to you challenges facing Welsh farming economically. So overall in Wales, I've witnessed during my study that farmers tend to have a lower raw product price than I've seen in France. Due to the fact that they're selling kind of relatively standardized product with an oligopolistic supply chain. But they compensate this with a high work productivity, that will lead them to having a relatively high added value on their farm. Like their economic performance is quite good compared to, for example, French farms, and given the landscape they have access to. But the levels of inputs are higher, and when you start to look at the agricultural income, you also realize that the actual income doesn't compare well due to the subsidy payment that tends to be lower, but as well the fact that farms have to pay a relatively high cost of land. Overall farming remains a low return, high stake industry, and over the last 20 years, I've shown in previous paper that we have a polarization of the farming system and of the land markets between low and high intensity and low and high prices. And I'm quite worried because we have a development in the last 20 years of a, financially rewarding from an income point of view, but technologically locked in, integrated supply chain for a number of products, including pigs or egg farming or poultry. Which are very integrated. Brexit, is a big word. I'm not going to dwell on that. I did a SWOT analysis around UK trade and agricultural policy. There are some opportunities and some challenges. We've seen mostly disruption for now, and like some uncertainty. And there's a whole context around COVID, that hasn't, or like the Ukrainian war that doesn't help things. But things are not as bad as they could have been. So there's still a deal with the number one partner, and we also have the opportunity of developing new policies more adapted to the context we're working in. Okay, just to summarize the challenges, we have significant farming landscape that embody this kind of iconic concept of unique place-specific farming system, agrarian system. But we have a wide range of challenges, and some on which Wales itself, the Welsh Government or Welsh actors have very little power. For example, on supply chains, most of the processing is done outside Wales. I'm now going to talk about the SFS, a scheme that was deemed for all and options for all. It was a very interesting kind of first draft, and I really enjoyed reading it. I think there was a lot of work put in it, and it was kind of promising. And what I mean as well is that given the goals of the SFS and the way the options were showcased, I could really see that this vision of sustainability and the three pillars of sustainability, economic, social, and environment, were kind of always there and kind of balanced all the way through the options, which is quite positive. But I don't know how it will pan out in terms of payments. To try to understand what would be whether farmers will buy in or not, I kind of restrained some parameters in terms of regulatory evolution, the fact around the labor market, cost of land, etc. And obviously, I went for risk limiting thing, constant labor, this kind of things to deal more easily with it first, but also because I realized that right now people are going for the lower risk possible given all the difficulties we're going through. To try to do this, I have a very useful tool, is the fact that I have kind of archetypes, model farms in each of my landscapes that are very, very much detailed. I understand very, very well what they're doing at each time of the year and how it can fit in within the farming system. And that's what I use to try to look at the accessibility and the richest possible update. Sorry about the amount of text on these slides. Around South Pembrokeshire, so the accessibility of the scheme. In lowlands, for example, in South Pembrokeshire, beef and dairy high added value farming system would require additional land to respect the land increase and ecological value, and might need it. But on low intensity holdings, it might be easier to spare some, but they need to intensify the management of other parts. Intensify how? That's another question. For small farm, 20% of land might be quite business critical and might be a real challenge to their economics and as well their functioning. In the Vale of Clwyd, it will be more difficult because I've noticed that farms tended to be more land constrained than in South Pembrokeshire, except for those having access to rough grazing. Those would be the ones that wouldn't have any too much problem to fit in the scheme, like accessibility criteria. In the uplands, there will be a lower proportion of challenge farms, but because most of them have access to rough grazing or a relatively large amount of tree already planted, but most of the challenge would have only access to one landscape and would be relatively small or medium-sized farms, mostly family farms as well, so that's something to keep in mind. And another element would be the difficulty in terms of access to land. Wetter conditions, sometimes the more difficult soil, steeper slope, that make it more difficult to work with, and that could create a clear challenge to make some options work quite well. Overall, in terms of universal options, I would say there's a requirement for training and clarity around standard setting that would be quite important, and that on which a lot of the things that I've just showed, all of the things I've the challenges around accessibility could revolve. For example, how much do we, when we look at the tree percentage, what do we decide through it? What is decided in terms of, are we looking at the canopy? Where can they be? Do we allow agroforestry? These kind of things could have a real impact on whether the scheme is accessible or not. There will be constraint for tenanted farms, but I'm not breaking any news to you. And when I'm looking at optional layer of the scheme, it will be more easier to get in when you're in the upland area or when you have valuable like rough grazing or recognized environmental features. But again, that's nothing new. For now, I don't really know for the cooperative layer of the scheme for now. And what challenge I could see is like the limited cooperation I can see between farms and the quite competitive vision between farms on economics and on markets, on livestock markets. But at the end, the fact that the cooperative element of agrarian system have kind of disappeared through time. So it would be very positive to revive them, but I realize it might be a challenge. Overall, I think the accessibility might be a question of opportunity, as usual, and not everyone will be equal. When we're looking at the reach and possible uptake, there might be a lot of operational constraints for some farms, but there will be additional resilience from my point of view as a farming scientist, and it could be seen as positive in today's context, and a number of farming systems are already doing it due to the context we are living in right now, with high input prices. And I think a massive challenge would be the amount of farm work available on each farm, on top of farm management or like other economic activities, which takes me to the next step. What do we prioritize, the scheme or the economic activity? And when we're looking at it from the economic performance of farms, I'm not going to break any news to you today on this, but high added value production system, dairy, hens, potatoes, and even high added value beef and sheep system will have will be over the threshold in terms of scheme rate payments. So for them, it's less interesting to to take up the scheme and to go into a lot of operational constraint for now. But we have to keep in mind that the actual income, relatively a part of it, relatively a sizable part for some, even for a high added value production system, is still linked to the subsidy. For now, we still have relatively high payment, like rental charges and non-land cost, which means that these added values, are lower in terms of actual income. And as a result, during crisis time, the share of subsidies in the actual income per family worker is much, much higher. And it's a significant buffer for now. So that might, we have to keep this in mind whenever we're considering whether it's a good opportunity for uptake. For the more crisis liable systems, for example, on beef, it would be interesting to take it up, even if the payments are not as high as their added value or their economic performance. Right, so a couple of things to add. Payment would be more important for beef and sheep. There will be a cash flow element for a number of business, most of all through selling seasonally their production. And I expect the capital element for this scheme to be highly popular, so that's nothing new about this. And I would say as well that something important would be to showcase that it's needed and that it can benefit farming system and food security, which is still something important for farmers. Right. So I'm now gonna try to showcase to you, to talk about what could be the impact of the SFS on farm entering the scheme. I hope I haven't lost you. I'm sorry there's so much text on the slide. But I really tried to kind of take a broader view than I usually do to take things together, to bring things together from my work in different areas in Wales. So I'll try to answer a couple questions, mostly around organic farming, some evidence to showcase the economic impact. So 3-step, modeling the policy, modeling the changes on selection of modeled farm, my archetypes, and looking at the impact economically. So modeling the scheme. I took from a number of hints, be it from the Q&A or what the scheme could be, but as well basing myself on the CAP data available for my study areas. So I try to take the assumptions as follow: funding constant, farm area constant. I had to make some assumptions in terms of transaction costs. I think the Welsh Government is really trying to bring them down quite low by having farmers to do a lot themselves in terms of assessment. In terms of split between the options, I tried to take some assumptions as well around there. So the universal layer payment, which has been confirmed will be per hectare, I took the assumption that it would be like the BPS today with a threshold around 54 hectares, which might like kind of a redistributive payment, which I think is quite positive to support family farm and medium and small-sized family farms. And I tried two options for the optional payment. The first one is basing myself on an area-based payment. And kind of slightly higher than last year for some, trying to, kind of create have a proxy of what it could be, which was less than perfect, but as you will see, a good first guess. And the second one, and trying to consider the balance between what's required and high value elements, features on the farms. And the second one, it being a function, taking into account the available labor on the farm to do some work in the scheme, to work in the scheme. So the more land you have per family per worker, and the less your payment would be the more land you have per family per worker, the less your payment will be, because you will have less time available to do the work in the scheme. I also did like a payment for capital work, only for the share that is retained by the farm. And again, it depends on the labor available and the peak working times. So you can see this second option was kind of a step up in terms of trying to narrow down what it could be. I took some assumption in terms of scenario, in terms of economic parameters. So with some high prices and low prices for the inputs and outputs and inputs, I took the assumptions that high prices would take place at the same time as low prices, which we can discuss it, but it really shows the farm, how they deal with the most challenging times in farming. And usually these kind of elements, low price for outputs and low price for inputs, happen together on a relatively long time series. I mean, at a yearly scale, something like that. Big for this year, like the last couple of years, we've had like 2 or 3 years, we had high prices for outputs as well for inputs. So right now it might start to change, but trying to eliminate the very narrow variation. So I took 3 scenarios to try to look at possible impact, and now I'm going to showcase to you how it panned out on farms. Again, I'm sorry for the amount of text on this. It's just for you to have a look at what kind of modifications are enacted on each farms. I tried to make them more self-sufficient, take into account the land that would be required to have the 10% tree planting, 10% like ecological value farmland, but as well to try to adapt to the regulatory context around the actual pollution, the NVZ, which has been just changed. So yeah, but overall, the things to take into account is I've enacted a number of things to be more self-sufficient, being nitrogen fixing plants, increased measures to reduce as much as possible the inputs on farms, be it like more production of high, for example, production of crops on farms, be it barley or like cereals to replace cake, nitrogen fixing plants to replace fertilizer, improving, outwintering to reduce the use of inputs inside, etc., etc. But overall, we're going for more self-sufficient farms, more resilient in terms of, the impact of weather events, for example, and lower inputs and outputs. Why did I take the assumption that we would have lower output? It's not an assumption, it's linked to the implementation of the self-sufficient package. You have to be more realistic given what farms have available and given their labor available on farms. So it meant that you have to reduce the output, which in some cases also means that the output standards are changing, which means that, for example, for my potato archetype, I had to adapt the supply chain expectations and modify the mix of what they were selling. So that's quite important transformation that I had to do. I also modified the things on even for organic farms, there were some changes again, and the same kind of compromises and changes. Right. When we look at the economic performance impact of this, let's first look at the added value per worker. Basically, the economic production of every farm, of the farms. Overall, it's very positive. In the 2 kind of difficult scenario that we're looking at, like high prices for inputs and outputs and low prices for inputs and outputs, we can see that most of the farms showcase an improvement in terms of economic performance. Right. There are some things that we have to take into account, and there are some systems where you can see there has been little or no evolution, which are here in yellow, or in some system for which has been like a degradation. The system in yellow that are on ends is simply because there's a technological lock-in. Basically, you have Formula 1 kind of pool laying hens that require certain feed, and I cannot substitute their feed or the kind of inputs they have with some things that are produced on farms. So these farms will still be reliant on imported feedstuff, imported products from out of Wales to meet the standards of feeding and of living of these animals. So that's quite important thing. For now, the technological locking challenge is not addressed as of now, and there's little margin on it for the moment. The organic farm is the other one that loses a bit in terms of added value, mostly because it already made a number of changes that improved its self-sufficiency and going even further in terms of reducing its input use, so the production levels are even lower. But we're starting to lower the work productivity here as a result. Most of all, what's the result of this improvement in the economic performance is linked to a reduction in terms of input cost, intermediate consumption, what is bought in by the farm or used to produce and it's a reduction for all farms in all scenarios, including for the organic farm. Everyone is benefiting from it, but as you can see, the change for hens as well as changes for like the organic farm are quite low. Organic farm that is on mountain, more mountain style, sorry, because I have an organic dairy farm that is doing quite well in implementing those changes, as you can see here, at the top of the list. When we start to look at things from an agricultural income point of view, per family worker this time, we can see that, again, most systems would benefit from the change in terms of implementing those policy changes. What's particularly interesting is that, for example, if you have the potato producer second in the list, the potato producer second in the list, you have a very much improvement in terms of, when it's facing a crisis, it will deal with it much better. But for this particular archetype, there has been a need to change things along the supply chain to get to this point. So very, very sizable changes overall. The only farms that have kind of lost, if you look at it in terms of actual income, would be hens, producers that tend not to, feature as to be as well off in terms of actual income as before. Again, due to their kind of lock-ins and the fact that parts where we are able to improve the self-sufficiency of the farm are parts that do not matter that much in terms of agricultural income. Interestingly, when we start to look at the actual income for the organic beef and sheep farm, it's lower than it was in the reference vision for the one that is on the strip of land, which has mountain land. It's a bit worse, but it's way better for the organic dairy farm. So the picture on organic is not as stark as we thought. And still a challenge, mostly for organic farming in uplands, which is partly linked as well to, I'll show you later, but to a big reduction in subsidy with the end of organic subsidies. If we start to look at the share of subsidy in the farm income, so we have like improvements overall in terms of, a reduction in the share of subsidies in the farm income. Incomes that are overall higher or maintained, except for organic farming on large farms, the way I modeled it, and as well as some kind of system, like the end systems, which are not as good. Okay. So I was telling you, the ones that lose the most tend to be some farms that have either a lot of land, so large strip of land, so relatively big amount of land, and it means that the way I modeled it, they lose a lot more compared to what they have now in terms of subsidy payment. You will notice that a number of other farms tend to gain from it. Why do they gain from it? It's simply because the way the scheme is designed, I expect that renting out farmers, people that rent out the land to other farmers on 11-month contract, would not be able to claim the subsidy anymore. So the subsidy would go to the farmer renting the land if they include it in the scheme, which in turn leads to a net increase in terms of subsidy payment for a number of lowland farms, which is very interesting. So the way it's been designed, you have a net loss for organic farms, at least on the second pillar, and on uplands, and from farms that own all the lands. That's the one that that's the ones that lose the most in terms of subsidy would be large, owning all the land, and like possibly being organic as well. All right. Okay. So when we look at the second option in terms of optional element design, it kind of corrects some of the imbalance that was created in terms of in terms of benefiting farms with a high number of family workers or a high number of workers, which means that, for example, the organic beef and sheep farm here with some mountain land is gaining from it quite a lot of the second element, and as well the time available that they have enables them to have to spend more time on capital items to improve the farm overall. So it means that in turn they gain a lot from this subsidy redistribution. So overall the second element is quite positive, but nearly everyone is gaining from it, which as well might create a challenge because you only have a range of archetype, but you would need to check that the amount of money available would stay relatively the same, which I haven't been able to do for the second element, the second optional design. Most of the gains that you would witness here are for farms that have a lot of labor available and family labor, which means that they can benefit a lot from the capital items sometime. They have some time to deal with it, or for example the potato farming archetype, given the structure in terms of peak working time, they have time to work on some capital improvements on the farm, be it like pond, etc., which would be, that kind of enables them to gain more from this redesign. Right. So if I was to summarize what I've learned from it, it's like the transformation are quite ambitious. The fact that, towards more sustainable system, I think the scheme is quite balanced in terms of orientation. I think that the fact that there's no regulation on the land market might be a problem in terms of development of alternative farming options. Economically, the way I've designed the scheme, there are several caveats, obviously, around assumptions. It's not perfect, but I think the findings are positive. It could drive major benefits across Wales in terms of economic performance and reduce subsidy reliance as a whole. I think it has a benefit, when I looked at it, to reduce subsidy distribution imbalance in terms of per family worker, which would be something positive. Situation for organic farming is not as dramatic as I first thought. It might be more difficult for the farms that have less leeway in terms of orientation. The old plant farm didn't have as much leeway in terms of changes to its system to adapt to the new conditions and couldn't change as many things, limited by the agroecological parameters, in turns leading to little economic improvements or even worse. And there's a big question that comes out of my work, I think, is how do we get out of technological lock-ins in integrated supply chain? Because otherwise the impact on them would be quite limited. I'm now going to discuss what fears around the scheme as a systemic vision shows. I'll start by very positive points. I think that, and that I'm not going to talk about that much. I think that there's a kind of a spirit of co-construction and co-design that has been taken all along the scheme, and which is very positive. And then we think it's a way, we wrote a paper in June for a conference on this kind of culturally significant production landscape, as we have a lot in Wales. And one finding was that co-design is necessary, sometimes at a local scale, so I think it's a very positive element what is being taken forward. There's also a feeling that there's kind of a broad-minded around the TNC to make it adaptable to farms. But now I'm going to start to delve into some challenges that I've identified into the scheme. So the first one, so this is an example of a farming system in the Bala area. They have land on the hill and they have a lot of rough grazing. On this farm you have a significant harvest risk and significant work risk due to weather parameters. The short growing season is not made better by climate change. The cash flow is very constrained. You don't have a lot of profit. Most of the profit is farm subsidies that come at one point in the year, so it's a bit of a challenge. You have a limited landholding available and time available. And it's already low input farm. It's not compliant in terms of tree percentage. It has few opportunities in terms of markets or crop nearby or suppliers, and it has no succession. And I think we still have a risk. For example, in this case, we still have a risk in terms of delivery of this solution. If we plant the trees, they might not grow. So how do we deal with it? The tree types might not be adapted, and ecotypes might not be adapted to the kind of environments we're having. We might not have the tools to help them, drive them towards more self-sufficiency at parts, but they're already kind of low input, and more sustainable system that might require sometimes a more intensive use of the land, but sustainable intensive use of the land. We might need some crops, barley, to finish more the cattle. But how do we deal with this? Because the type of crops that I have are not adapted to this kind of weather risk that I have. They might topple down, etc., or give very low quality that would not be adequate to feed even to a cattle. So we have a challenge around here. I had some people in the Bar area that went into maize farming when it started to be introduced in the 90s. Relatively, finishing farmers. So we were talking about a relatively high intensity in terms of output for an upland system with access to mountain land. They stopped. Too much of a risk linked to harvest. You could make a mess too easily. And the maize crop wasn't not good sometimes 1 year out of 2. So how do you deal with it? And additionally, I'll make the point that the transition in this kind of places take a lot of time. You need to be sure that it's going to work. We're talking about businesses that have a limited amount of work available, free work. Farms are kind of constrained already in terms of working calendar. And whenever you're taking a risk, if you're implementing new fodder elements, and in turn it might impact your forage production. So we have kind of a changes taking place at an adequate step. So I just wanted to take this to have an idea of the economic and supply chain challenges. For example, tree planting, I identify it. I don't know whether my numbers are right, but there's potentially something interesting in terms of economic gain for Wales and the supply chain in Wales. And at the same time, in risk, do we have the trees available? If we import from out of Wales or other places, will bring disease in, etc., etc. Self-sufficient, and it's kind of a large amount of tree and large turnover when we look at it. So it's quite interesting to look at it. But now let's look at the self-sufficiency. We improved by 15% the area of spring barley in Wales. With the seed rate, it means that we require approximately 50 hectares of seed. Who will be adapting crops for kind of small agroecological conditions in Wales? Do we have the right types available? And it's quite a small market. So will there be a willingness to develop the solutions for to adapt to the kind of conditions that we have that were very peculiar? And we really need something adapted, because if we want to mitigate and adapt to climate change, it will be difficult to do so with main broad types that do not necessarily main broad breed types that might not be adapted. It's the same thing when we're talking about breeds of cattle, etc. When we look at, I think as well, the next step in terms of climate change mitigation and adaptation is we're still reliant on imported fossil fuels, and it's something that has not been addressed so far by the scheme. So I think it might be the next step in the scheme. That's what I've hinted at. But clearly there's as well a question of where it will come from and whether it will be adapted to the Welsh conditions. The development of the quad bike, we had to wait until probably 1980s to have four-wheel drives kind of equipment for farms, and that made a major difference for upland farming. But we had to wait quite a bit compared to lowland farms. And to have something adapted for them. I think with all the supply chain issues that we're having, it will be a challenge to deal with some of these elements of the scheme, to implement it towards a higher self-sufficiency. And I want to point out as well the low speeds of development improvement, where we're talking about breeding, be it animals or crops, soils, or even grass, it takes time. So yeah. Finally, training farmers and advisors. I already touched on it, but even for the first pillar of the CAP, there was like a 43% of SFS applicant. Sorry, SFS, not SPS. No, SPS. Sorry, SPS. That required some sort of assistance. So there's a clear question about what we're doing in terms of training as well, to bring people together. And it will be very important, but I think that's been quite well identified. So you might have hinted at what I want to come at. I think these bottlenecks for this transformation are an opportunity for Wales, and that's why I'm bringing them forward. I think we can supply those things from markets, wider markets, but they might not be as good, as adapted for what we need. It might not be available straight away and might not be fully adequate to deal with our co-evolution between the environment and the people, and this kind of cultural, economic and social elements that are so strong into Welsh farming and Welsh agrarian systems. If we go with timescale, the bottlenecks that I've described, I think we would accept a delivery risk. The supply chain versus the goals of the scheme, or a risk at the longer term in terms of sustainability, not adapted crops or stuff not adapted to Wales. Are we a buyer or an actor to develop our own set of things, equipment? I think it's quite it might be a strong way to word it quite strongly, but I think it's an interesting vision, an interesting way to put it. Wales is small, on the broad terms, in terms of numbers of farmers, in terms of different agroecological conditions and different needs, and the supply chain is quite concentrated. Which is not so positive. I think the speed of changes could overall clash. If we want to retain family farms in the Welsh culture, and for it to be sustainable. And for now, in the scheme, I think there's a need for research and supply chain vision, as I hope I've shown to you, to avoid those bottlenecks. I don't know how it has to be, can be integrated, or whether there's scope for that. But I think that otherwise it might be a delivery risk. And there will be a very important thing with this scheme, is that we will need a guiding mind. For a number of elements, for the standards, which axis of the scheme to develop. It will be a big challenge. But a key message, I think, is there's not going to be massive amounts of money. We've already lost 15% of the funding due to inflation. It's quite important that we retain the value of the scheme in the Welsh economy for it to benefit the Welsh rural communities as a whole. I think that will be my key messages to finish my presentation. I have 2 more slides that I wanted to be there, more as a reminder. I think that so far we haven't discussed so much horticulture and food security. This is a clear question about what scale do we want to support them, because for now it's only cooperative element, and I'm not sure that will be enough. I'm not sure it will be enough to develop it. I've seen limited scope for it to develop. Apart in some lowland areas near big pools of consumers, and when people benefit from an opportunity, so it's quite limited. So I don't know I have no direct solution around this. I haven't thought so much about it, and as well the new entrance scheme and the generation renewal challenges. The roads to generation renewal are quite narrow today, and linked to some systems that are not all do not always align with the sustainable farming scheme vision. Okay, so thank you for your attention. Thank you for listening my ramblings. Just a couple of recent publications we did, including one forthcoming. Everything is available either on request or on my website. And yeah, thank you for your attention. And I'll take any question either here or in private.